Hello, everybody. I'm Tom Dorsey, and I'm with two very unique people today. Ralph Lehman, who wrote the book, The Elusive Trade, and Joseph Rizzello, who is with me, who's been a friend of mine for 35 years, been in this business 50 years. And we're going to talk about the how and why the exchange-traded fund ended up coming to market. It's the history of the exchange-traded fund. Nobody's ever told this story. And this goes back to the very first one. And it does my heart some good. You know, I've talked about this so many times, so many places around the world. It's now in a book, The Elusive Trade, and we're going to talk about that today. So, Ralph, thank you very much for coming. Joseph, thank you very much for coming. And let's get into it. Ralph, tell me about how you began with the book and what made you want to begin writing this book and tell the ETF story that no one's ever told before.
Gladly. And it started with me going to an ETF conference because I knew absolutely nothing about ETFs. I was involved in the investment industry, and I thought this is something I needed to know from my clients, and had gone for several years. And what ended up happening over a couple of years is the conference became less important, and the after hours and meeting with the folks who had been involved in the industry for 10 years or more became more and more of an appeal. I started hearing these incredibly interesting stories, and having a love for financial history and a love for history as a whole. When I got back after one conference, I thought, I want to get a book and read on this because, again, truly amazing people, exceptional stories. How did this all come about? I couldn't find one. I could find bits and pieces in a couple of books, but no one had it. And I'd had an interest in thinking of writing a book at some point in time, but never really had a subject. I felt like with this, I'd found a worthwhile subject to pour myself into. And I had some changes in circumstances that allowed me to devote some time to writing the book. And so with that, I just started scanning the internet because I really didn't know that many people in the industry. And fortunately for me, one of the people I'd met at the conference was a lady by the name of Arlene Reyes, who Joseph knows. And Arlene couldn't really tell me the story, but she had a great black book of contacts. And she gave me several contacts, key people who ended up helping me throughout the story. And perhaps the most key person was Joseph Rizzello. And so I may have started with an email. I don't even know if I did that. I picked up the phone. I gave Joseph a phone call, and we hit it off from the get-go. For me, it was like drinking out of a fire hose.
Yeah.
Because Joseph is a wealth of knowledge. But Joseph was involved in this at the very get-go, and I realized my extent of my knowledge was about the depth of a puddle when it came to this story. In some ways, that's not necessarily a bad thing. When you don't know something about a subject, you're more willing to ask questions. Joseph was more than willing to answer the questions. And so he devoted a lot of time. I don't know how many times we talked together on the phone, but he walked me through the story. When I hit things I didn't understand, he was willing to walk back and explain it to me. And so this is how I started off writing the book. And fortunately for me, I think God directed me to several people who not only knew the story, but then had contacts who led to additional contacts. So that's how the idea of the book germinated.
Why the name The Elusive Trade?
Sure, because as I was talking with people like Joseph, like Gary Eisenreich, Bob Toll would be another person. And as I was doing my reading in market history, the markets hit a point to where they went from trading just individual stocks. And he can tell the story much better than I can. But for years, you went out and you bought blue chip stocks. And that was fine. And that's, you might go into a trust account, $1 million trust account, and might hold 4 or 5 stocks paying dividends. But over time, we developed this concept of developing a portfolio of stocks. Markowitz in his writing. And when people looked at trading portfolios, the whole notion of how do you trade an entire portfolio was something that they started grappling with. And then Black Monday hit, and that really brought it to a head.
So, thus the name the elusive trade.
This was something that people were looking to do on the exchange. And it wasn't elusive because people couldn't figure out, hey, how to put this together. It was elusive because they were tiptoeing through a minefield of different groups who didn't want their turf encroached on in several different ways. And that appeared and reared its ugly head in several different places, of which Joseph is quite familiar with.
Well, why don't you weigh in, Joseph? You and I go back 35 years. I remember being head of option strategy at Wheat First Securities, which is a very large regional firm. When you came out with the first options on indexes, that was such a major revelation to me. Was, oh my God, here's the first time we can actually trade an index instead of a stock. So that was like the shot over the bow. You were the ones that put together the team that brought the cash index participation unit. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so Tom, I went to work for the Philadelphia Stock Exchange in 84, 85, I think I started. And I've been blessed in my life to have the knack of being in the right place at the right time. One of the first things that Nick Giordano, who was the CEO of the Philadelphia Stock Exchange back then, when he hired me, he had this concept and this idea. I can only assume that they had been talking about it for a while, that wouldn't it be great to take an index like the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average and make it look and feel like a stock? And in our backyard was Vanguard in Malvern, Pennsylvania. And, I have to just, shout out for Jack Bogle, who really is the father of indexes. He created the S&P 500 index in 1975. And interestingly enough, 10 years later, when we started to work on the concept that Nick had explained to me, the S&P 500 was trading somewhere around, it had a value of $250 or $260. And they had about $300 million in assets. Actually, ultimately, when we launched in the middle of 1987, it had somewhere in north of $1 billion. So when Nick gave me this project today, it's interesting because we had a vision that this would be a successful investment vehicle. But there's no one that can envision the kind of incredible growth that the ETF model would create. Really, if you think about it, it's an industry inside an industry, the ETF business. There's over $7 trillion in indexes now. ETFs, can apply to almost any kind of financial instrument, whether it be an individual stock, whether it be a fixed income instrument, a commodity. It crosses geography. ETFs are now all over the world, even in emerging market countries. So it's just astonishing. I like to say that it's hard to believe that the moment that I started working on this with the team that Nick allowed me to assemble, and I'll talk about the team in a little bit, it's I like to say that it's probably or arguably the most effective investment vehicle to come to market in the modern era. And for me to be part of, it's followed me everywhere I went in my career. And so I have a special place in my heart for it. As you know, Tom, I met you back in 1985, and actually you became a member of my team because you had great insight because you work you work very closely with financial advisors. Mm-hmm. Back then we called them stockbrokers. Right. So you became a part of my team. As a matter of fact, after we created the product, you traveled all over the world with me to promote it. There's so much credit that needs to be given to so many people. And I think Ralph does a great job of that in his book through the years. I just was in the right place at the right time. Nick threw this project on my lap. It was one of the first things I started working on at the Philadelphia Stock Exchange. And he allowed me to put a great team of people together because that's what it takes. It takes a team. No one person can do this. I'm not sure where Nick came up with the idea. So we took the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average, S&P at 250, divided it by 10, became a $25 stock. The Dow Jones, I think, was somewhere around 1,500 at the time, right? Mm-hmm. Turn that in, the divisor of a 100 became a $15 stock, right? And the concept was a great concept because, and it, by the way, it wasn't successful out of the gate. It took us 2.5 years to bring it to market, and then we could, we can go on from there.
Well, Ralph, tell me a little bit about the research that you did and the people that were involved in bringing it.
And the people were the research. So when I was trying to fill out the edges of the book, I was going to the newspapers and magazines and things and trying to gather information. But the vast majority of it came from being able to talk to people. And unfortunately, even though some time has elapsed, I was able to interview most everyone I would have liked. There were 3 or 4 notable people that stood out that I did not get to talk to. I was able to talk with Jack Bogle. Jack cracked me up because he said, well, that was 30 years ago. I don't really remember it that well. And he was never a big fan of ETFs, as many people are well aware. But then at that point, he started throwing out some details of his meeting with Nate Most with the Spider. And that was something that came after the SIPS product, but Jack at his age was still able to do that. So,
well, when you say SIPS product, that's the cash index participation unit that the Philly brought.
Correct.
And it actually traded on the Philadelphia Exchange.
And I think the Ralph throws out, Nate Most, I used to talk to him all the time, a great guy. And he worked with Steve Bloom, 2 very smart people. And we always like to tease them because when we filed the SIP product, they saw that it had a great utility. So they copied our filing right down to the typo. And of course, it was an arduous path. We finally got SIPS up and running in 1987 and listed it, we're able to list it and trade it on the Philadelphia Stock Exchange. And it was met by a famous lawsuit. The futures exchanges, for some reason or another, were threatened by this product. It was never meant to replace futures. It really was the mutual fund aspect of a trading vehicle that would be listed on an exchange, because mutual funds are priced once a day. This was continuous pricing, and you could margin it, you could do lots of different things with it. So we were met by a lawsuit. Well, when I say we were met, the SEC was met by a lawsuit for approving the product, and it's a famous decision. It's called the Easterbrook decision. You can find it online, and that was I think it's the 7th Circuit in Chicago.
10th.
No, it's not the 10th.
No,
it's not the 10th. I think it's the 7th. Right in the backyard of the futures exchanges. Right. And we figured that rather than protesting that, let's let it be heard there. And in 1988 or 89, the decision came out. Or 88, I guess it was. And what Judge Easterbrook found is that while SIPS had every element of a security, 99% of security, it did have some elements of a future, and therefore it couldn't trade on a securities and exchange, and then the rest is history. And, unfortunately for us, we stayed with the concept, and we challenged, we challenged it. And what would happen is the Toronto Stock Exchange, in the middle of all of this, really loved what we were doing. And they come and they spend a few days with us in Philadelphia. And what they did is they went back home, because back then your exchanges were not competing across borders, right? So they went back to Canada and they created TIPS, as you well know, Tom. And, TIPS was on their index, right? And what they did is they put the physical stocks.
Right. Therein lies the difference. Yeah.
And therein lies the difference. And
yours was backed by futures.
No, ours was a theoretical basket. That could be hedged with futures for sure, because you had the S&P 500 future. So they really took our concept and brought it to fruition, right? And created TIPS. And then, of course, Nate Mose and Steve Bloom took that, and I'll never forget it. It was early 90s. I was in Hong Kong doing a presentation on our currency options. And I get a phone call from someone who says to me, Amex is going to bring the S&P Spiders product, which is going to be back with, it's going to have a physical basket of stocks in place. And they talked about the creation redemption process and all of this sort of stuff, which was, all new stuff. And just the evolution of any great idea, and they deserve credit for it. And then they listed the product on the Amex, and it was sort of, my heart sank a little bit because we had a lot invested in it. And back then, Tom, you remember the first to market, it was tough to overthrow them. But they struggled with that product for the first couple of years. The interesting thing back then was the exchange never thought of the asset management opportunity. What they wanted was volume. We were looking for volume. So they put a deal together with State Street. State Street would manage the trust of the assets that would go into Spiders. And then Q's came. And then it wasn't until really the late 90s, early 2000s that iShares, Barclays, became the issuer of their set of ETFs. Right. And they saw the utility in the fact that they can gather assets to manage in the trust. And here it is, 34, 35 years later, trillions of dollars in these products, supposedly going to overtake mutual funds in terms of cash flows in.
Absolutely will.
Yeah, in 2021 or 2022. Right. It's far more efficient than a mutual fund. Mm-hmm. And the great thing about this, the great thing about this story is every mutual fund was against ETFs.
That's right.
They're all in the business now, Tom.
Well, Ralph, let you weigh in on the book. What did you find the most interesting part about writing the book and learning about the exchange traded fund? And
he's touched on it, that it was a process. Today it's truncated to people look at the spider and here, it's as if you opened up a can and here was an ETF. It was a process that was going on that historically it was developed on exchanges primarily. You had Leyland, O'Brien, and Rubenstein, LOR, who had done the portfolio insurance, who were a major player with this and did a lot of groundbreaking work. But it was the exchanges that were doing all of this innovation. So not only just this one product, but Joseph and his team, Nate Mose and his team at the Amex, there was so much going on at the exchanges. The financial markets were going through an amount of change that they really hadn't in their history up to that. And it was against the backdrop of companies were merging. And so therefore, since everything was company-based up until the 80s, you had fewer companies that you were seeing trade on your exchange. You were forced to go and innovate and bring new products. And so against this backdrop of exchanges closing down, people losing their jobs, there was a need to come up with new products. And this was just one of the many new products, but it was by far the most successful and very versatile product. It's amazing how versatile the ETF is. And then something else that has been touched on is just how many people were involved. Because when I think about a new security, at least I did before writing the book, you think about some of the big financial firms and they get some brainiacs who are mapping things out. This was nothing like it because it was very much operationally based. The ETF, the beauty of the ETF is how it trades on the exchange and how you can put any type of product in it. I do a presentation and I liken it to modern shipping because the old image is shipping, you think about on the waterfront, Marlon Brando, longshoremen, and how they're loading the boat and how time intensive that was. You look at modern shipping, what do you have? You have these containers. Yep. Everything's standardized. You fill up the containers, and when the ship comes to port, it spends very little time there. Everything is loaded up. You can think of that as the transaction. Transaction costs have come down. They're much more efficient. and the ship goes out to harbor.
And it's interesting to see when the container ship comes in, they may lift one container, set it on a truck that's in gear. He's gone.
Exactly.
And that was just one container. It's not like they're taking all the containers off and setting them on the dock. There may be a truck there. I've watched that on TV. That's so interesting. This one truck might be going to California.
Yeah, and I think I just want to. Ralph mentions a couple, LOR, Leland O'Brien Rubenstein. You remember them, portfolio insurance.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I used to present our SIP product, and they would be there as well, and they were the brainiacs and the academicians. And the interesting thing about that product, portfolio insurance, it worked until it worked until it had to work in 1987, and it didn't work. It didn't work. Yeah, and I remember that they're really, really good guys and really smart guys. But my feeling about it's interesting because, Tom, years later, I was hired by Vanguard. And I remember meeting with Gus Sauter in the mid 90s, after spiders had come. And clearly ETFs were now on the map and people were paying attention to them, even though that they were not knocking the cover off the ball. But, spiders was doing decent volume and gathering decent assets. And I called on Gus because, as you know, Tom, we had a lot of indices that we traded: gold and silver, semiconductors, utilities. Oh, yeah. Options on them. And nobody ever thought about sectors then, right?
Exactly. I mean, for me, running an option department, that was like a major victory.
Yeah, I remember. And that's how you and I got connected, because you loved some of the things we were doing. And Gus was nice enough to meet with us. And he said to me, Joseph, he said, we're not going to do anything like that at Vanguard. And as I told you, all the mutual funds back in the 80s, late 80s, were against the whole concept of ETFs because they saw it as a threat, to their mutual fund business. And they saw the importance of the creation redemption process and the tax efficiencies that it brought.
Tax efficiency, yeah. That is.
And there are still people out there challenging the whole concept of creation redemption, right? Which brings the exchange of the basket in kind. That gives many ETFs don't have tax distributions or have very minimal tax distributions. So it's a big advantage. So Gus said no. I went to work for them in 1998. I hadn't been there 2 months. Gus called me in his office. He says, "You're one of 4 people in the firm that knows we're going to get into the ETF business." And there again, Tom, I'm given the opportunity to help them bring ETFs to market. Now, unbeknownst to us, back then, Barclays, we had no idea that they were thinking about doing the same thing. And Vanguard had the big advantage because we had 10 million clients back then. So we had distribution to clients. BlackRock, they're now BlackRock. Barclays, iShares, they didn't have any distribution, right? They were just managers. So we had an advantage, but we had no idea that they were talking to S&P, and S&P gave them an exclusive contract. Vanguard already had a contract that dated back to when Jack Bogle created the S&P 500 in 1975. So I urged them to call. We need to talk to S&P, and I couldn't get anywhere with that. And then ultimately, S&P finds out that we want to bring an ETF. They call Vanguard and they say, "Why didn't you call us? We just gave an exclusive contract to Barclays." And Gus said, "Well, we already have a contract." One thing led to another. There was a lawsuit. Vanguard lost twice, and they couldn't list an S&P 500 ETF. They had to go to MSCI, and restructure what they were going to do, which really was a setback. Now, I hate to say that Vanguard lost the first half, right, to iShares, but they're winning the second half. It's a great organization. I mean, they were able to recover. And the interesting thing about that story, Tom, many years later, I wound up being a consultant for iShares. And I tell the story to one of their principals, and he starts laughing. And I'm saying, "What are you laughing at?" He said, "Had we had any idea at that time that Vanguard was thinking about bringing an ETF, I would have never got the $100 million to fund iShares." So it's so
How things happen.
and it's funny how like it just follows me, So and today I'm involved in an asset management firm, a registered investment advisor, and ETFs are a principal asset allocation tool for us.
Right. So can I add something?
Oh, please do, because
Just
it's all
to-
about you and the book and Joseph.
To give credit where credit is due. So when Vanguard came out with their ETFs, they were called Vipers.
That's right. I
They
remember
had the
that.
snake, and it was an index participation equity redemption. So even with their name, they were giving homage to your product off the Philadelphia Exchange.
Well, the interesting thing that I was there when we picked the name, I was there. So Gus said, we got to think of some sort of an animal or insect because of spiders. So we came up with vipers. That's a true story. That's a true story. But they not only did they come up with an viper, vipers like a snake, right?
Yeah.
A reptile. But the acronym actually worked. But today they did away with that.
And Bob Toll, Morgan Stanley did the same thing when they came out with their international array of funds. They called it WEBs, World Equity Benchmarks.
That's right.
So you had SPDR and you had WEBs.
I had forgotten those things. And I've been involved with this from the beginning with you. And boy, this really brings back old memories. That's what you've got in your book there, is all this information.
Right. Can I make two other points?
Yeah, please.
Things that
Make
stood
all
out?
the points that you want to make.
Because the ETF to me is one of these rare instances where when you're in the financial industry, there's a pressure to produce, there's a pressure to make money. I get that. The ETF is one of those rare times where there really was an emphasis on doing what was best for investors. And so you saw that when people were looking to bring the product, Joseph, you wanted some trading volume on your floor.
Yes.
Nate wanted the exact same thing. But when you look at how the ETF is built, its design, and the uses, it did a great job, not only in the ETF world, in driving down the costs, transaction costs, because that's put pressure on the mutual fund industry. That's one of the reasons where even for people who only use mutual funds and would never touch an ETF, you're paying lower transaction fees because of this. So the ETF put investors first in a lot of ways. It gave them an instrument where they could access markets. They could access sectors of markets that they couldn't before. They could do it in a low transaction way. There can be issues with it. Nate Most, who was at the Amex, wrote an interesting letter to the SEC. And he wrote this after he'd stepped away from the Amex. He ended up going and being an advisor to Barclays.
Yes.
But he wrote a letter saying that they're toying with the idea of an actively managed ETF. Now we accept them. His call was, SEC, give it a different name. If you give it a different name from an ETF, then investors will know that they're getting a passive product when they buy an ETF. So you see this theme woven throughout, that there was a lot of putting investors first, thinking what's really good for the investors, not what's going to line the pockets of some of these firms. And I think a big reason of that was because it was exchange driven. They wanted good products. They wanted good products that would trade. And what was going to appeal to people? Something like this.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that Ralph raises, because it was about the exchanges that were the intellectual capital behind product development. It's kind of reversed now, right? I mean, it's now the issuers that are responsible, for bringing these products, and they need the exchanges to do it. But you and I have talked a lot about this, and in my hours of conversations with Ralph as he was writing the book, which I'm really grateful to him for, he put a lot of time and effort in memorializing a lot of the history of ETFs. But ETFs are part of what happens in our industry, Tom, at least in all the years that I've been in it, this creative destruction, right? It's taking the old and making it better. And Ralph mentioned earlier that everybody wants to protect their turf. So there's a lot of pushback when people hear new ideas, right? And what's that going to mean to me, i.e. the lawsuit from the Merck the law, the mutual funds filing amicus to the lawsuit, and today this there's a lot of disruption in the industry, but we can point to bringing options on stocks in the 70s was revolutionary, right? Mayday. Fixed commissions to negotiated commissions, the advent of the discount broker. They'll never make it, right? They changed the world, right? And ETFs, monumental changes, part of the disruption. And now technology has become the great disruptor in our industry. And it's like the big giants, if they can't change, they fall. So you always have to be conscious of where the puck is going, right? Who would have ever thought? Actually, we're now at 0 transaction fees buying stocks and ETFs. That all happened a couple of weeks ago. What a great time to be a customer, an investment client, right? Fees have been reduced to nothing.
When you think about that, it just hit me that when Charles Schwab came online, that was in 75, when they went to negotiated commissions. That hadn't changed, fixed commissions, for 183 years, I believe. 183 years where they shook hands and said, okay, we're in the good old boy school. Nobody changes commissions. 183 years later, Charles Schwab comes on. Discount brokerage. Now, from there till now Schwab the other day says, no commissions.
Right.
0.
And who would ever think that Schwab is going to be giving advice? They give advice now, Schwab. Right. They're in the advice business.
Right.
Full.
They manage portfolios. They manage, and they do a great job.
Yeah. But when you talk about fixed commit, you paid a lot of money back then, Tom, to buy and sell a stock from a stockbroker.
And you couldn't go to another firm and get a better deal.
You couldn't get a better deal because it was fixed. And then you had negotiated, which opened up competition. And it's the same thing. When I came into the business, we had quarter point spreads, 25 cents. Then it went to eighths, 12 and a quarter cents. Then to 12 and a half cents, and then to 16ths. And for a long time, you had a 6 and a quarter cents spread between the bid and the offer. You make a lot of money. And then what did you have? The algorithmic traders, the high frequency traders. You went from 6 and a quarter cents to pennies. And computers came in and they took over and they replaced people and they made the markets far more efficient. What a great time to be a customer in this business.
Who benefited?
Yeah.
The customers.
Yes.
You were about to weigh in on something.
Well, actually 2 points. So taking what you're saying, think of how expensive it would be to have a diversified portfolio under the old system.
Oh.
Every stock you bought, you were paying a huge commission, because you have to buy them individually.
That's
so
right.
Between the fees and the ETFs, individual investors are light years ahead of where they were.
That's right.
30 years ago, 40 years ago. And then one other thing that stood out about the book is that it was as if God's hand was on the timing of the ETF, because had things been a little bit differently and Vanguard had accepted the product from the get-go, I don't think you would have had the innovation. It would have been relegated to a Vanguard product.
Right.
And they may have very well ruled the roost from the get-go. Secondly, patent law went through quite a bit of change, because we went through a period where process was patented. And therefore, if you'd been able to patent your process, you would have been given the golden car. You would have loved to have done it, right?
Well, we've tried to patent products at the exchanges. We can never get there.
Right.
We always tried to do that. And that was the big, you made another great point earlier too, Ralph, and that is back then, the competition among exchanges was fierce. So everybody was careful, right? Everybody was careful not to let their idea out of the bag because when we did filings back then, when we were creating new products, right, we would file them privately before they became public. And we would go down and work with the SEC staff so that they can understand the financial, the financial benefit of creating products like this for clients, and help smooth the process of approval. Then they would become public. And you knew once they became public, there was going to be somebody right behind you competing against you. So you're right. We could not patent products at exchanges.
Right.
And we looked into it. All the other exchanges looked into it. That's why these licenses on indexes were important at the time, because they gave you, if you had an exclusive license from Dow Jones, S&P, McGraw-Hill, those people, then, it's like the OEX or the S&P 500 option. They had exclusive licenses.
That's right.
So you couldn't create the same product.
And there's the beach property in the ETF world, right? Through the licenses.
Interesting. Well, guys, we're probably running out of time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's good stuff. And again, I like to say to a lot of the folks that are now coming into the business, been in the business last 5 years, 10 years, look, what an opportunity they have. Technology has changed the world. It's the great equalizer. We have developments with technology each and every day to make not only markets more efficient, but make the world we live in. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do we live in this world without Uber and Waze and smartphones and Venmo? All of that, that's the great thing about the free market system. It rewards innovation. We don't ever want to lose that as a country. We are the leaders of the world when it comes to innovate, right? And to me, this industry has, I cannot, for me, it's a second career, Tom, right? It's a second career. I have to thank you for it. When I sold the National Stock Exchange back in 2011, at the end of 2011, to a competitor, I was doing some things after that, but I was looking for, I prayed on it actually. What am I going to do? I knew I wasn't ready to quit. It's part of the vitality that I have, is to keep going. And here I found the second career, and I work with a great group of people at New Square Capital a bunch of young people who teach me every day. I teach them. We share. And I have to thank you for that, because you led me in this direction. Whoever believed that I would be involved in portfolio management and managing wealth for clients? It's fascinating. It's a whole new world to me. But the opportunity for the younger generation of people over the next 10, 15, 20 years is just, it's remarkable, the opportunities that they're going to be presented with.
Right. Anything to say on the end?
I hope people will check out the book. I have a love for history, and one of the reasons why I love it is you can apply so much of it to what you're faced with. And like Joseph has said, there's been a history of innovation, and perhaps not knowing each particular one isn't as important, but developing that mindset. Everything in here was very entrepreneurial. And with that, there are people who tried and failed just wildly, magnificently. And yet the markets were better for it. So I hope people will check out The Elusive Trade. I enjoyed writing it. Much more enjoyed the people I've gotten to meet, such as the men here in the room and the people I interviewed over the phone. Been a wonderful experience, and thank you for this afternoon.
I've enjoyed reading it. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I want to thank Ralph for putting a couple of years into the recording of this history. Yeah. And the hundreds of hours of time that you spent in doing this. It's not easy to write a book, particularly on a topic like this. So I congratulate you, and I wish you much success with this book.
And you should thank my wife as well. So
yeah, she had to put up with it.
Yes,
my wife's the same thing.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, too, for having us today. Appreciate it very much.
It's been great having you.